Good morning, church family. It's good for us to be together this morning, and I am thrilled that we get the chance to worship and to kick off our week in this way. I know that there are a lot of our families who are out of town for fall break as the kids are out of school, but for those of you who are here, thank you so much for joining us. It's really a thrill to be able to be with you today. And I want to remind you, we're going to take communion together here in just a couple of minutes. The Lord's Supper, this is a practice we do every week, and many of you grabbed the supplies for that at the tables on the way in. But if you missed that opportunity and you didn't see those, we have some ushers, I think, who will bring those to you. If you'll just raise your hand and let us know that you need the communion supplies brought to you this morning. I want to get you thinking about the rituals that are a regular part of your life with other people. I want to get you thinking about the traditions that mean a lot to you. Maybe as you watch college football, or you think about the ways that the fans at those different stadiums work together to show support for their team. Maybe you can think about some of the rituals and the traditions that really mean a lot. I can remember when I was in high school and we would have these school-wide pep rallies on the day of a big football game during this time of the year, and the whole student body would get together. We would cram ourselves into the gym, and it was a tight squeeze, but everybody made it in there, and the cheerleaders were cheering, and the band was playing, and the dance team was dancing, and the coaches were making these inspiring speeches about how the entire team was going to come together and work together to bring home a victory and bring honor to our school. And at the end of the pep rally, the band would play the school song, and we would all stand there with a fist in the air, and we would sing these lyrics that had been written 40 years ago by some student, way back when. And we would sing this song, which was pretty unusual to think about a group of teenagers standing around singing together in public. That's not something that happens in very many arenas of life, but in that moment, we were all connected by our school spirit. And the song that we sang was part of the way that we stayed connected with each other. Maybe you remember a similar experience. In a few days, my wife's college class is going to have their reunion, and it's going to be an opportunity for them to get together and to reconnect with old friends, old classmates, and they'll relive stories and they'll share memories about the years that they spent together at Abilene Christian University, and they'll laugh about inside jokes, and they'll remember some of the mischief and the shenanigans that they got into when they were students together. But at the end of that reunion, after all of the storytelling and the picture sharing and the updating about what's going on in their lives, all of those classmates will likely stand in a circle and they'll sing without needing to be reminded of the lyrics in any way. They'll sing an old hymn, "The Lord Bless You and Keep You," which students at Abilene Christian have been doing together for decades at the end of almost every gathering. And there will be something about that singing, something about those words that will reinforce and strengthen the connections and the bonds that they have with one another. And that's so important because it's hard to keep groups of people connected, right? It's hard to keep groups of people moving in the same direction. Many of you have experienced this challenge at work. In the last few years, there's been such a momentous shift in the way that we do remote work and the way that we're able to work from home in different locations. And so corporate culture has changed. And so teams are, there are people who are part of teams at work, but they never, ever end up in the same room. I know people who work full-time jobs and they never have to leave their house. And there are lots of people who only have to go into the office once or twice a week because most of their job can be done remotely. And it's nice to not have to commute, but there's lots of challenges to this because you don't feel quite so connected to your teammates. And so managers are trying to figure out how to build that kind of connection through Zoom meetings and Slack threads and trying to help people stay connected and collaborating with one another, even though they're never in the same room. And every organization has to face the challenge of keeping people connected with one another. And so most organizations figure out some rituals. They figure out some practices, some habits, and some traditions that remind them of what makes their connection meaningful, what makes their connection special. Families tend to have rituals like this. Maybe it's in the way that you celebrate birthdays together, or maybe it's a monthly extended family meal that you have together, something that reinforces the bonds that you share. When I watch my son's football team get ready to take the field, as they're ready to go and get started with a new game, they have this ritual where they huddle up and they all put their hands in the center, and on the count of 3, they shout a word together that reminds them of the common goal to win that they all have. And it's no surprise that church has its own rituals too, right? I mean, some of it is in the songs that we sing and the ministries that we are passionate about and the ways that we serve together. Each church has some things about it that are unique, but one of the rituals that most Christian churches engage in together is our practice of this meal that we call communion, or sometimes we call it the Lord's Supper. We call it that because Jesus started this for us. Jesus kicked off this tradition, this ritual. In the New Testament, there's 3 different recordings, 4 if you include Paul's description in 1 Corinthians, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke all tell the story of Jesus setting this up, of Jesus establishing this meal for us. They tell the details of how Jesus took a loaf of bread and he broke it and he shared it with his disciples and asked them to eat with him. And then he took a cup of wine and he shared it with his disciples and asked them to drink it with him. And Jesus envisioned his disciples participating in this meal together on a regular basis. He said, when you get together and you participate in this meal, he says, do it so that you can remember me. But it's not just about a tradition. It's not just about a religious practice that we're supposed to accomplish so many times in a week or a month. This meal that we're taking together is about helping us stay connected to Jesus' life and teachings and power. And so I want to read to you some of the words that Jesus shared on the night that he started this tradition. Some of the words that Jesus shared on the night that he instituted this ritual, this meal with his first disciples. And this is going to come from the book of John, and John doesn't specifically tell us about the logistics of this meal. He doesn't talk much about the specifics of eating the bread and the wine. But in John chapter 15, these words of Jesus come from that night when Jesus was around the table with his first disciples. And here's what he said to them. He said, I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. I want you to imagine the metaphor here. Think about the different images that this creates for you as you picture it in your mind's eye. Jesus, this is a parable, but Jesus is saying, he says, there's something about me and the Father that is at work in you. I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, so that it will be even more fruitful. Some of you gardeners in the room know exactly what this is all about, that sometimes you've learned that you have to do that hard thing of pinching off the bulb or taking off the blossom that first arises so that more fruit can come. Jesus says, you are already clean because of the word I've spoken to you. Remain in me, as I also remain in you. Jesus knows that he and his disciples are about to be separated physically, that they won't be able to see him in their presence anymore, but he's promising that this is not the end of their connection. Remain in me, he says, as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. It must remain connected to the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine. You are the branches. Picture that. Jesus says, if you remain in me, and if I remain in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. That's a serious statement, he says. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If you don't remain in me, you're like a branch that's thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up and thrown into the fire and burned. If you remain in me, though, and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Now, remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I've kept my Father's commands, and I remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you, and so that your joy may be complete. Can you hear Jesus explaining the purpose and the source of your life? Can you hear Jesus saying that his goal for us is that we would be fruitful, but that there's only one way. There's only one way that the fruit of the Spirit, that the fruit God wants to produce in our life could possibly be produced, and that's if we stay connected to Jesus. In fact, I want to remind you this morning, I want to tell you this morning, and as we prepare to participate in communion together this morning, I want to make it so clear to you that the goal of the Christian life is to stay connected to Jesus. I don't know how you could put it any more simply, but this is the goal of what being a disciple is all about. This is the goal of what being a Christian is all about. The goal of the Christian life is to stay connected to Jesus, to stay connected to his teaching, to stay connected to his example, to stay connected to his memory, to stay connected to his Spirit, to stay connected to his love. The goal of the Christian life is for us to stay connected to Jesus. And I want to tell you that there's a lot to that. There's different ways to stay connected to Jesus. We stay connected to Jesus through times of solitude with Jesus and silence with Jesus. We stay connected through time in the Scripture with Jesus. We stay connected through fellowship with other people who are connected to Jesus. There's lots of things to this, but the first tool that Jesus gave us was this meal. This meal that reminds us that connection to Jesus is what we're aiming for. Recently, I spent some time in a seminar with a therapist that was talking to ministers and minister couples, and they were teaching us some centering breathing practices, some opportunities to use your breath intentionally to try to bring calm to your body, to try to bring calm to your spirit and your spinning mind. And I think communion is meant to be a centering practice. Communion's meant to be one of those practices that we come back to regularly, that we come back to frequently, and it reminds us, it brings us back to the heart of what's most true about us, that He is our God, and we are His people. It's a centering practice to be reminded of the truth of God's love for us, so that when we're anxious about what's happening in the world around us, communion reminds us of our value to God. And when we're concerned about the health of our families and the health of our friendships and our relationships, communion reminds us that Jesus is working things out for the good of those who love Him. Communion is this centering practice that invites us and re-invites us and reminds us that staying connected to Jesus is where our spiritual sustenance comes from. But I want to suggest to you as well that it's more than just a ritual to bind our hearts to Jesus. Because when Jesus created this tradition, when Jesus instigated this practice, he was sitting around a table. He was sitting in a community. He was sitting with a group. And communion is meant to strengthen the bonds between us who have put our hope in Jesus Christ. Last week in our message, we recalled together that when someone came and asked Jesus, what's the most important commandment that God would have his people follow? Out of all of the different laws and all the different instructions, out of all the commands that God has given to the people of Israel, thinking back to Old Testament times, this person asked Jesus, which one of all of those is most important? And Matthew tells us that Jesus could not narrow it down to one. That there were two commandments that were of equal importance. Two commandments that go together, that really can't be separated from one another. Jesus said, the first of the greatest commandments is that you should love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your being. But then Jesus said, the second one goes right along with it. The second one is like it. Jesus said, the other most important command is to love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus was establishing that there's a direct connection between our love for God and our love for the people God created. You can't have one without the other and be spiritually true, spiritually consistent. There's a direct connection between our appreciation for God and our admiration and love for the people that God created alongside us. Which is why, I believe, right after the verses from John 15 that we read just a few minutes ago, the very next verse in the next paragraph of John 15, Jesus doesn't offer any transitional statement, doesn't indicate that he's kind of going off on a different train of thought. He just continues the same thought after talking about all of the ways and the reasons why it's so important for us to stay connected to the vine so that we might bear spiritual fruit. Jesus says, my command to you is this: love each other as I have loved you. I imagine Jesus saying this while they still could taste the bread on their breath like you and I can right now. He said, my command to you. This is one of the very, very few times that Jesus actually gives a specific instruction to his followers of how they're supposed to live their life. And instead of casting some vision, inviting them to something, or teaching a parable that lets them imagine how to be faithful, this is one of the very few times that Jesus is just very, very explicit and gives an instruction. In fact, this is a new command. He says, my command to you is this: love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You know, when I was growing up, every time I ever heard that passage read, every time I read that passage for myself, I imagined that meant physical death. That laying down your life for your friends meant dying on somebody else's behalf. And it's obvious to me to see that that's an incredibly loving gesture. Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down their life for their friends. And we could all imagine or remember stories, or we've seen stories in media, we've seen stories in movies and books about people who offered their life as a sacrifice to protect somebody else. And we all admire stories like that. When I grew up, I heard this verse read, greater love has no one than this, that they would lay down their life for their friends. And in my imagination, that meant to die for somebody. And that's admirable. But I'm not sure that's all Jesus was talking about here. Because Maybe in some moments, maybe in some instances, maybe the harder thing is to live for somebody else. To lay down your life and your ambitions and your preferences and your desires, and to put first the needs and the desires and the wishes and the hopes of somebody else. That's the kind of challenge that you can't just make a decision once and just do it and then walk away. It's the kind of decision that you got to make over and over and over again. To put other people's needs ahead of your own is an incredibly challenging invitation. And Jesus says, if you were to lay down your life for the sake of somebody else's life, there's no greater way you could ever show your love. He says, you are my friends if you do what I command. What does he command? Some of us who grew up in church or grew up reading the Bible, we immediately think of all of the different instructions that are in this entire library of books, but Jesus has just told them what his command is. My command is this, that you love one another as I have loved you. And you're my friends if you do what I command, he says. I no longer call you servants because a servant doesn't know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends. For everything that I learned from my Father, I have made known to you. You didn't choose me, but I chose you and appointed you so that you might go and bear fruit that will last. And so that whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give to you. This is my command. There's some repetition here. That means it's significant. This is my command. Love each other. You know, when I was growing up, my understanding of communion was too small, I think. When I was growing up, we partook of the communion every week in our church. I was not allowed to partake of communion until I was a baptized believer in Jesus, and that was part of our church's tradition as well. But I watched as all of the people around me took communion virtually every Sunday of my life. And it was stoic, and it was quiet. And when I heard people introduce what we were doing, when I heard people reflect on this practice that we were about to engage in together, when I heard people talk later about what it was that they were experiencing, all of the talk was about what was happening between my heart and God. I think my communion understanding was too small. Because as I reflect more on what Jesus was doing, as I reflect more on this ritual that Jesus was setting up for us, as I reflect more on the tradition and the practice that Jesus was imagining that we would engage in, it always happens together. It always happens in community. When I was growing up, we would have services on Sunday night, and I lived in a refinery town where there were a lot of shift workers, and so every Sunday night, somebody would get up and invite those who had been, quote unquote, providentially hindered from being able. Some of you are going to smile at that because you remember from your church too. But we said, anybody who was providentially hindered from being at worship with us this morning, we're going to give you an opportunity to participate in the communion now. Now, they could have done it by themselves. They could have packed a piece of cracker and a little cup of grape juice to take to work with them. They could have done that. But it wouldn't have been the same because it didn't happen in community. It didn't happen in connection with others who were on this same journey. It didn't happen in a family of people. And so we said, now that you're able to be here, now that your shift is over at work and you're able to be with us, let's participate in this meal together so that you don't miss out. And it was beautiful. It was beautiful that we remembered that the whole point of this exercise, the whole point of this ritual, the whole point of this tradition is that we take this meal together so that we can stay connected to Jesus and so that we can stay connected to Jesus, right? It's just simple logic, but if you stay connected to the vine, you will naturally stay connected to the other branches on the vine, right? If you're not connected to the vine, you won't be connected to the other branches. But if you get disconnected from the other branches, it means you've become disconnected from the vine too, because they're all one in the same. They're all connected together. And communion is meant to remind us of who we are and who we are. You get the difference? Communion is to remind us of who we are to God, but also who we are to each other. And staying connected to Jesus means staying connected to his other followers. Loving each other, demonstrating love for one another the way that Jesus has loved us. And so I'm going to invite you to take the cup, and I'm going to pray for us in just a second. You might leave the lid on until I finish praying, just for your own convenience there, but I'm going to invite you to take the cup, and this morning, I want to invite you to imagine what it was like at that first communion meal. My best guess is that they shared one cup, that they had one cup of wine and they passed it around the table. And it doesn't bother me that we don't do that today, but I want you to imagine the significance of what that was like. That nobody took this meal, nobody drank this cup by themselves. They did it in community. And after Jesus was taken back to be with the Father and prepare a place for us, and as the disciples continued to meet on a regular basis and participate in this meal, nobody took this meal by themselves. They took it when they gathered together so that they could remember Jesus, and so that they could remember the connection and the relationship and the family that Jesus made possible. And so today, as we drink, let's not drink this alone. Let's drink it in the togetherness that's only made possible because of Jesus.